The scent of ash still clings to the winter air, not the smoke of a cooking fire, but the bitter residue of 1,000 burned villages. For a century, the blades did the talking. The sound of a clan name was always followed by the snap of a musket or the wet sigh of a dying man. The country was a field of blood and ambition, divided by the iron whim of warlords. Now, the mud roads are strangely quiet. The drums of war have been muted by a single, crushing victory. A man in lacquer armor, the color of burnt earth and deep red, stands watching the sea. He has won the final game. Iron will and cold strategy have delivered him the entire archipelago. Tokugawa Ieyasu. The name settles over the land like a shroud, heavy and permanent. He did not ask for peace. He commanded silence. He began to build walls that were not merely stone but law, walls that would turn the flow of history inward. For 200 years, that silence is what Japan received. The story of the shogunate is not merely a history of laws and castles. It is the deeper memory of a world sealed behind steel and cedar gates, a world where the turning of the tides was the only sound permitted to break the absolute hush. To walk the stone paths now is to listen to the echo of that long stillness. What does a nation forget when it is forbidden to look outward? What kind of destiny is etched into the parchment of absolute control? That destiny was etched in the iron will of the man who commanded the silence. Tokugawa Ieyasu understood a crucial truth. That power was not in winning the final battle, but in ensuring the battle could never start again. His new regime, the Bakufu, was not merely a government. It was a masterpiece of cold, administrative geometry designed to crush any spark of independent thought or action. It was built upon the ruins of the last war, a deliberate, suffocating weight. His first enemy was not an army, it was the memory of ambition. To neutralize the great lords, the powerful Daimyo whose loyalties were forged in blood and not law, he instituted a brilliant, soul-crushing policy. It was called Sankin Kōtai, the alternate attendance system. Twice a year, the great warlords of Japan were compelled to gather their entire entourage, thousands of samurai, servants, and pages, and march in a colossal, crippling procession across the kingdom to spend a year living under the shogun's direct, watchful gaze in the new capital, Edo. The road was long. The financial drain was deliberate. Every 2 years, a lord's treasury was emptied by the immense cost of maintaining 2 vast estates and funding a royal-sized migration. It ensured they could never gather the wealth required to raise an army against the shogun. But the real genius was the anchor left behind. When the lord traveled home to his domain, his family, his wife, his children, his heir remained in Edo. They were not prisoners, of course. They were merely permanent guests of the shogun, a polite, absolute guarantee of obedience purchased with the dearest blood of the domain. The loyalty of 1,000 samurai was meaningless against the safety of a son. Japan was thus turned inward, its eyes fixed perpetually on the journey to and from the great city of Edo. The country became a system of finely tuned movement, all energy directed toward the center of power. The only approved ambition was to serve the peace of the shogun. Yet outside the walls of this newly ordered world, the tides were still turning. Across the water, the world was in motion. Foreign ships, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, and English, were bringing more than just trade goods. They carried a more dangerous cargo, ideas. A singular god, a loyalty that superseded the clan, the daimyo, or even the shogun himself. Christianity had taken root, primarily in the southern domains where the long reach of the Tokugawa had been slowest to settle. To the shogun, this faith was not religion. It was an invisible Trojan horse. It taught that there was a power greater than the lacquer armor of Edo, a kingdom that existed outside of Japan's borders. It was the one crack in the architecture of absolute control. If loyalty was divided, the old chaos would inevitably return. The fire of civil war had been smothered, but the embers were still glowing in the dark corners of the soul, kept alive by this foreign flame. The shogun faced a final choice: engage with the world and risk the return of anarchy, or eliminate the threat entirely, sealing the nation shut. The decision he made would define the next 200 years. He began the Great Purge, an eradication of the foreign faith enforced by a terror that only absolute power can command. The missionaries were expelled, the converts were martyred, the ships were burned. What began as an internal consolidation would become an external quarantine. The shogun etched a final decree into the scrolls of law, a pronouncement as cold and final as the steel of a newly cleaned blade. The year is 1639. The great doors of the Japanese archipelago are about to swing shut. Japan would not merely find peace. It would disappear from the map of the known world, locking its history, its destiny, and its people inside a cedar chest of forced isolation. The world was told Japan was gone. And for 215 years, this was the absolute crushing truth. But an iron silence always demands a price. The price was stagnation. The great seafaring Japanese ships, the ones that had once plied the waters to Siam and Manila, were emptied. Their hulls were dragged ashore and left to rot, surrendered to the tide and the salt air. To build any vessel capable of crossing the deep ocean became an offense against the state, a crime punishable by immediate death. Japan retreated into a deep, deliberate amnesia. The world outside its borders was systematically excised from the collective memory, becoming little more than a fading rumor, a whispered ghost story told only by the oldest fishermen. They drew an invisible, absolute line in the swirling, cold water of the Pacific. On the Japanese side, all foreign influence was deemed poison. With the outer world sealed and the immediate threat eliminated, the shogun's eye turned inward, focusing the crushing, absolute weight of his power onto his own people. The true, enduring threat was never the foreign god, but the local lord, the daimyo, the proud men whose loyalty could still be questioned. To neutralize these powerful men, to prevent the return of the ancient, destructive chaos, the shogun conceived a masterpiece of psychological and financial warfare: the Sankin Kōtai, the system of alternate attendance. Every daimyo was now compelled to spend 1 year in his home domain, and the very next year in the capital city of Edo, at the feet of the shogun. It was an endless, debilitating cycle of mandatory travel. But the mechanism had a deeper, more brutal core. When the daimyo returned to their distant provincial domains, they were forced to leave their immediate family, their wives and their heirs, behind in Edo. They were hostages, forever living under the shadow of the great castle walls, ensuring total obedience. The system worked with brutal efficiency. The procession of lords, massive retinues, servants, and samurai winding along the great arteries of the nation, especially the Tokaido Road, was constant. It was an extravagant, crippling drain on provincial wealth. The lords were bankrupted by the cost of their own compliance, rendered harmless without a single sword having to be drawn in anger. The daimyo was transformed from a potential king into a gilded cage animal. The warriors themselves were equally transformed. For 2 centuries, the warrior class, the samurai, would have no wars to fight. Their steel was slowly traded for scrolls. Their purpose was repurposed. They became the bureaucracy, the silent police force, administering a state of peace with the same cold, absolute loyalty they had once reserved for battle. They were now the instruments of total control, maintaining an unnatural stasis. This, then, was the crucible. The shogun had created a world of absolute, profound stability. Every man knew his exact place in the chain of command, from the lowest peasant to the highest lord. The lines of class were absolute. But a peace built on total repression breeds its own kind of decay. While the shogun's political control was perfect, The nation's social and economic health was quietly beginning to rot from the inside. The rigid rice-based economy was struggling to feed a growing population. Famine was a frequent and unwanted guest across the provinces. And the very samurai who were supposed to uphold the perfect order were going quietly, miserably broke. Meanwhile, a new class, the merchants, who sat at the bottom of the official social order, were growing obscenely wealthy on the stability they did not earn, using the very trade routes the daimyo were forced to travel. The social contract was fraying, thread by thread. The beautiful, perfect cage of the Tokugawa Shogunate was beginning to show faint, almost invisible stress fractures. The iron silence was brittle. The world outside knew nothing of the great, controlled experiment unfolding on these islands. They were unaware that the peace they had forced upon themselves was unsustainable, awaiting only the final, inevitable test. The moment when the door they had sealed shut would finally be knocked open. For the warrior class, the silence was a quiet, suffocating humiliation. Their swords, symbols of 1,000 years of battlefield glory, had been reduced to ceremonial accessories, rusting quietly in scabbards that knew only silk, never blood. The samurai were forced to become bureaucrats, their honor bound not to the fight but to the ledger, the census, and the meticulous control of the rice tax. They were police, not heroes. The rice stipend, once a mark of absolute privilege, was now a heavy shackle. Its value sank with every passing decade as the currency-based economy the shogunate tried to ignore boomed. They were cash-poor and land-rich in a world that increasingly valued liquidity. They were forced to borrow, silently, shamefully, from the very people they were supposed to despise and protect against, the merchants. The lowest order of man was now the master of the highest. The merchant class, excluded from all political power, used the sheer, fluid nature of money to buy up the debts of the impoverished, proud samurai. They held the economic leash on the entire warrior class. This inversion of the natural order was the central, devastating secret of the Pax Tokugawa. To secure this corrupt, brittle stasis, the shogun had attempted the impossible, to stop time itself. The policy of Sakoku, the sealed country, was less a defense and more a defiant, philosophical declaration of permanence. The archipelago became a closed, isolated world, trusting that the rest of creation would simply cease to move forward. The shogunate built a fortress of exclusion, believing that if they could not see the outside world could not hurt them. The only deliberate pinhole of contact remained in the isolated harbor of Nagasaki, on the tiny, fan-shaped island of Deshima. Here, a handful of tightly controlled Dutch traders were permitted a precarious foothold. Their trade was minimal, their movements watched, their reports meticulously filtered and censored by the shogunal authorities. They were a necessary evil, a crude, pinhole camera to view the distant, unimaginable storm. For 2 centuries, the entire nation lived in this fabricated, absolute darkness, confident that their self-imposed ignorance was a form of protection. But the world outside had not frozen. While the samurai counted rice and filed bureaucratic reports, the nations of the West had discovered fire all over again. The industrial age was a relentless, hungry furnace forging massive iron ships, steam engines, and weapons of unimaginable speed and power. Empires were not built on rigid rice stipends anymore, but on coal, on steel, and on a relentless, territorial hunger for resources and markets. The stability and isolation that had protected Japan for 2 centuries now made it brutally vulnerable. The shogunate was running a closed medieval economy against an open, rapacious modernity. The vast distance of the Pacific Ocean, once Japan's loyal and silent defender, was shrinking by the day. The first tremors of the coming storm started subtly. Distant, dark plumes of smoke on the northern horizons, too large for any local fishing vessel. Ghostly sightings of foreign whalers pushing ever closer to the prohibited coastline. Each sighting was a whisper of defiance against the shogun's iron will, a dark promise of intrusion. The response from Edo was not adaptation, but a desperate doubling down on denial. The laws of seclusion were reinforced. The coastal defenses, pitiful wooden and stone cannons, were merely symbolic. It was the frantic, panicked gesture of a political structure that knew deep down in its core that its time was running out. They were simply waiting for the single, final, decisive blow. The Tokugawa Shogunate had spent 250 years preparing for an enemy from within, a rival daimyo, a peasant revolt, a treacherous samurai. They never imagined the true enemy would arrive from the ocean, smelling of oil and salt, and wrapped in the deafening smoke of an unstoppable industrial revolution. They had sealed the door and silenced the nation. But in the summer of 1853, the door did not just receive a polite knock. It was assaulted by the relentless, cold geometry of 4 massive, black-hulled steam warships, commanded by the uncompromising force of the American Commodore Matthew Perry. They arrived not by sail, but by fire. The great iron hulls, coated in tar and soot, were nightmares made real, floating monuments to the mechanical future the shogunate had desperately tried to outlaw. The smoke, thick and oily, hung low over the Bay of Uraga, a permanent, vulgar stain on the perfect blue sky of the Japanese summer. It was the smell of industry, of oil and coal and machine shops, a scent utterly alien to the rice fields and cedar forests. For the people gathered on the shore, this was a vision of hell, of pure, inorganic power. The noise alone was a violation. The steam escaping the valves, the massive paddle wheels churning the sacred water. It was the sound of a world that did not need wind or God or the seasons, only coal and iron. The Japanese called them the Kurofune, the black ships. The name became a word for dread itself. The news reached Edo Castle like a thunderbolt that killed on impact. The entire machinery of the Tokugawa Shogunate, built over 250 years to maintain absolute stasis and tradition, froze solid. The sea. Complex rituals of governance, designed to slow time itself, became useless. The Council of Elders, the Raju, were men trained only in precedent and deference. They knew how to handle a rice tax dispute or a distant samurai rebellion. They did not know how to handle the modern world, delivered in 4 iron boxes. Their response was a desperate, terrified vacuum of decision. The shogun, Ieyasu, was already a sick and failing man. The weight of this oceanic catastrophe broke him instantly. Out in the bay, Commodore Matthew Perry was not a diplomat. He was an executioner for the old world. He understood the psychological warfare of the age. His orders from Washington were simple: open Japan, by negotiation if possible, by overwhelming force if necessary. He anchored his fleet, the Susquehanna, the Mississippi, the Saratoga, and the Plymouth, at the precise point of maximum intimidation, positioning the cannon ports to stare directly at the defenseless city of Uraga. He refused every traditional Japanese stalling tactic. He refused to sail to Nagasaki, the one approved port of limited contact. He refused to speak to any official who did not represent the highest authority of the emperor himself. It was a calculated, brilliant, and devastating insult to the shogunal authority. For days, the Japanese tried to manage the crisis with ritual and delay. Courteous officials in silken robes rode out, pleading for the fleet to leave the sacred waters, offering food and water in exchange for departure. Perry would not budge. He ordered his men to conduct hydrographic surveys of the bay, firing signal shots that echoed across the terrified fishing villages. They landed a heavily armed Marine contingent to drill on the beach. The sound of American cannon practice was the sound of the future arriving to claim the past. Finally, a compromise was struck, born of pure, primal terror. The shogunate would receive the American letter. In a carefully staged ceremony, Perry was met by two of the highest-ranking daimyo. He delivered the message, wrapped in a velvet box of rosewood, a beautiful container for a terrible threat. The document was simple, direct, and utterly devastating to the Tokugawa worldview. America wanted trade, coaling stations for its steamships, and respect for its seamen. This was not a request, it was a unilateral decree. He would leave now, Perry stated, only to return next year with a much larger, even more terrifying fleet to receive Japan's final, binding answer. He gave them a year, 12 months for 250 years of isolation to unravel. The black ships steamed away, their smoke slowly dissipating on the horizon, leaving behind a silence far more deafening than their arrival. The silence of absolute choice. The shogunate now faced the void. Surrender the nation's soul and humiliate its ancient honor, or choose a catastrophic war they could not possibly win. The final chapter of the great dynasty had begun. The rosewood box sat in the inner sanctum of Edo Castle, a beautiful vessel holding a terminal diagnosis. It was not a treaty, it was a curse. The highest officials, the Raju, gathered, their faces etched with the truth they dared not speak. The age of divine isolation was over. For 250 years, they had been the unshakable center of a world they had contained. Now, the world had arrived, uninvited and armed, and the very foundation of the shogunate's legitimacy was dissolving in a cloud of American steam. Its authority was derived from its ability to enforce the sealing of the nation and maintain the Pax Tokugawa. If they could not keep the foreigners out, what were they? They looked to the young shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the latest in a long, unbroken line, but he was already weakened, perhaps broken, by the immense pressure of the ultimatum. The dilemma was existential. To accept Perry's terms was to invite the slow, corrosive death of Japanese culture and ancient honor. To refuse was to invite immediate, catastrophic war. There was no precedent for this kind of crisis, and in a move that signaled the dynasty's desperation, the Raju committed the unthinkable. They broke the code of silence. For the first time in history, the shogun's council sought advice from outside its own rigid ranks. They circulated copies of Perry's demands to every major daimyo and, critically, to the imperial court in Kyoto. This single act was not a search for consensus. It was an admission of failure. The ultimate authority had just outsourced its judgment, and it was the crack that brought the entire structure down. The response from the provinces was not unity, it was a roar. The great lords, long sidelined and repressed by the strict Tokugawa hierarchy, seized the opportunity. The consensus was overwhelming, fueled by a deep, ancient pride: expel the barbarians. The rallying cry ignited across the country, starting in the western domains and echoing back toward the capital, Sano Joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. It was a movement that weaponized the very history the shogunate was built to suppress. The emperor, a ceremonial figurehead for 2.5 centuries, was suddenly thrust back into the political spotlight by the very men who served the shogun. This wasn't just a foreign policy crisis. It was a civil war waiting for a signal. The warrior class, the samurai which had upheld the peace, now found a new, righteous mission: to protect the sacred soil from the foreign stain and restore the emperor's divine authority. The shogunate tried desperately to assert control, to recall its orders and reseal the discussion, but the authority had already slipped away, dissipating like the smoke from the departing fleet. The year passed in a blur of panicked meetings, furious debates, and escalating terror. Then the inevitable silence was broken again. News arrived from the south. Commodore Perry was sighted. Not just 1 or 2 ships this time, but 9 vessels, bristling with 43 cannons. A floating city of steel had materialized off the coast of Uraga, anchoring exactly where it had promised. But the shogunate was no longer in a position to answer. The young shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had received the initial ultimatum, had died a month after Perry left, crushed by the unprecedented burden. The succession was uncertain. The government was fractured. The imperial court in Kyoto was in open, defiant opposition. And the man who now sat in the seat of power, the Taro Ieyasu, faced the impossible reality. The American fleet had returned, and Japan, the sealed kingdom, was not ready. It was already tearing itself apart from within. The great confrontation that Tokugawa Ieyasu had sought to prevent for 300 years was now upon them. The silent dynasty was about to be consumed by the fire it had spent centuries suppressing. The final, irreversible moment had arrived. The 9 black ships did not need to fire a shot. Their presence alone was the detonation. They stood off the coast, silent, immense, a cold argument in steel that dwarfed every wooden vessel the shogunate could muster. Commodore Perry had returned not as a negotiator, but as a judge, ready to deliver sentence. Ieyasu, the man who now held the collapsing kingdom in his hands, understood the math instantly. It was not a negotiation. It was a formal surrender, wrapped in diplomatic paper. Japan's ancient defenses, the proud samurai swords and the scattered, antique cannon, were relics facing the industrial age. The Tokugawa dynasty had ensured 3 centuries of peace at the cost of technical stagnation. To resist Perry's fleet was not brave, it was annihilation. It meant watching Edo, the glittering capital of the shogun, burn under the concentrated fire of 43 modern guns. The choice was simple yet unbearable: open the door a crack or have the entire wall blasted down, shattering the dynasty instantly. Ieyasu chose the crack. He chose survival. In March of 1854, the document was signed, the Treaty of Kanagawa. It was a short, dry, transactional piece of paper that undid 3 centuries of painstaking isolation. The iron gates of Sakoku were not merely unlocked, they were forced open, admitting coal-powered smoke and the overwhelming smell of the world. The world that Tokugawa Ieyasu had fought so hard to banish had returned with a vengeance. For the man who signed it, the ghost of the ancestor must have stood nearby, silent and condemning. The dynasty had failed its fundamental mission. But the greater danger was not the American fleet that now sailed away, its mission accomplished. The greater danger was in Kyoto, the ancient seat of the imperial court. Ieyasu had dared to act without imperial sanction, asserting the shogun's authority over the divine will of the emperor. This was a violation of the deep, unwritten contract of the dynasty, and the Emperor Komai felt the ultimate betrayal. The emperor had already become the rallying point for every disillusioned samurai, every displaced nobleman, every furious traditionalist in the land. Now, the shogun's perceived cowardice gave them the moral high ground they had craved. A new ideology, a poison that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades, boiled over, becoming the fire that would consume the shogunate. Sano joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. This was no mere political slogan. It was a religious and military crusade. It gave the samurai class, who felt their purpose dissolving in the long peace, a new, sacred mission: to tear down the Tokugawa dynasty and purify Japan of the foreign stain. The samurai were not fighting Americans, they were fighting the shogun himself. The regent saw the tidal wave rising. He recognized the nature of the war that had begun. It was not fought with cannon on the sea, but with ideology in the capitals. The shogun, unable to expel the foreigners, had to expel the traitors. To save the dynasty, Ieyasu made a final, terrible calculation. He would become the hand of iron. He would suppress the internal fire with a purge of unimaginable severity. The quiet streets of Edo and Kyoto would soon run red with the blood of those who dared speak the emperor's name in open defiance. The treaty was merely a prelude. The civil war was the main event. And Ieyasu, the man who signed the surrender to the West, was about to sign his own name onto a death warrant that would consume both his enemies and, ultimately, himself. The silence of 300 years was broken, replaced by the sound of the assassin's blade drawing from its sheath. The blade was called the Ansei Great Purge. For nearly a year, Ieyasu governed Japan through terror, a chilling, singular force against the mounting wave of dissent. He saw the disease of disloyalty and believed the cure was absolute eradication. The iron gates of Edo Castle, once symbols of impenetrable peace and order, now became the maw of a terrible state machine, swallowing the nation's conscience whole. The targets were not the common criminals or petty thieves who littered the docks of the open ports. They were the architects of resistance, the most respected minds of the age, the philosophical vanguard of the Sano Joy movement. The regent swept across the capitals, striking down high-ranking daimyo and the influential scholars who dared to question the shogun's absolute authority. Men like Hashimoto Sanai, a brilliant young mind from Fukui, and Nariaki of Maido, a powerful, hereditary lord who had long been the internal thorn in the shogunate's side, were stripped of their titles, their honor, and their freedom. Most tragically, there was Yasuda Shoin. The revered intellectual and teacher, the very soul of the new movement, was hauled from his quiet studies and thrown into the dungeons. Shoin had done more than preach. He had given the emperor loyalists a theological foundation for rebellion. Now he was declared a subversive, an enemy of the state, his ideas deemed a poison more potent than any Western gunpowder. Ieyasu ordered the public execution of dozens of these intellectual leaders. Many more were imprisoned without trial or forced into perpetual house arrest, fading into obscurity, stripped of their wealth and influence. The regent had hoped to cut the head off the snake of Sano Joy. Instead, he created an army of ghosts, martyrs whose names were whispered in every tea house and every samurai barracks. Every execution was a seed of vengeance planted deep in the hearts of the emperor's loyalists, the roots of the civil war growing stronger with every swing of the executioner's sword. Ieyasu's victory was immediate, total, and tragically hollow. He had secured the dynasty for a single, bloody season, but he had signed the final blood oath that guaranteed his own rapid demise. He knew the cost of his choices. He had seen the hatred in the eyes of his subordinates, the cold formality of those who served him out of fear, not loyalty. Every dawn was a risk. He had become the most powerful and simultaneously the most hated man in Japan. He moved through Edo, the city he ruled, like a hunted animal. His protective detail grew larger every week, yet his world grew smaller. He was trapped inside the rigid formality of his own power, a tyrant waiting for the inevitable blow to fall. The stage was set on the third day of the third month of the third year of Ansei, March 24th, 1860. It was a day of brutal driving snow, a swirling white curtain that turned the spring morning into a dark, frozen landscape. The heavy, wet flakes fell straight down, an omen that muffled the sounds of the city, creating an eerie, unnatural silence. Ieyasu was following his ritual, the short, guarded journey from his residence to Edo Castle. His procession of 60 men, heavily armed, made their way across the moat. They approached the Sakuradaman Gate, the grand entrance to the shogun's domain, where the path narrowed and the shadows deepened. Then a sudden, blinding flash. A single shot from a Western-style pistol broke the snow's oppressive silence. A group of men, 18 samurai, emerged from the swirling white curtain. They were Ronin from Maido and Satsuma, the bitterest enemies of the shogunate, bound by an oath to avenge their fallen comrades. Their purpose was simple, bloody, and sacred: vengeance for the martyrs of the purge. The quiet peace of the morning was shattered by the scream of steel on steel, the shouts of the guards, and the desperate, close-quarters violence. Ieyasu's sedan chair lurched to a stop. The regent, the man who held the fate of Japan in his iron grip, was trapped inside the wooden box while the snow turned red around him. The shogunate's guards were caught entirely off balance. The snowfall was their true enemy, masking the approach of the attackers and deadening the defensive shouts. These 18 men were not common bandits. They were samurai, honed by years of resentment, driven by a fury the shogun's men could not match. Their attack was swift, coordinated, and utterly brutal. The first few guards fell almost instantly, the steel of their swords slick with blood before they could even draw their blades fully. This was not a battle of honor, but a slaughter in the blinding white curtain. The veteran escorts, trained only for parade and rigid formality, broke under the onslaught of sheer, focused hate. Loyal retainers tried desperately to form a barricade, sacrificing themselves to shield the small, dark box that contained their leader. But the Ronin were relentless, their movements economical and deadly. One man in particular, Aramura Jisiman, a swordsman from Satsuma, fought his way to the heart of the procession, ignoring the panic, aiming only for the sedan chair. The snow-covered path to the seat of power was now a crimson mire, a terrible, swirling map of the failed defense. With a final, desperate cry, Aramura cleaved through the side of the wooden box. The thick wood splintered with a sound like a pistol shot, exposing the man inside. Ieyasu. The regent was already weak. He had been struck, perhaps by the initial pistol shot or by a stray sword thrust that had passed through the thin wood shell. He was slumped forward, unable to move, unable to draw the short sword he carried, unable to speak, the iron of his will finally dissolving. The moment was silent, suspended between the chaos outside and the man's inevitable end. For the men of Mito, this was more than assassination. It was a purification, a sacred sacrifice to the spirits of those it had purged. Aramura yanked the regent from the shattered remnants of the chair, dragging the once powerful, now helpless man onto the freezing, blood-soaked ground. And then, the ritual of revenge was complete. The architect of the Iron Rule, the man who had brought the foreign powers to Japan's doorstep and silenced every voice of dissent, was struck down, left lying in the slush and ruin of his own imperial gate. The killing was fast, brutal, and silent. For a terrifying, eternal second, the only sound was the hissing of the falling snow, trying desperately to cover the dark stain on the stone. The attackers had achieved the impossible. Their oath fulfilled, many of the Ronin fought on, seeking death to elevate their act to martyrdom. Others melted back into the white chaos, carrying the severed head of the regent, proof that the 250-year dynasty was no longer sacred. The 18 men, or what remained of them, had struck at the very heart of the Tokugawa power. Inside the high walls of Edo Castle, there was disbelief, quickly followed by a frantic, desperate effort to conceal the truth. A man like Ieyasu could not simply be killed on the street by a handful of rebels. The myth of Tokugawa invincibility, the illusion of the shogun's absolute mandate, could not survive such a public execution. So a desperate lie was manufactured. Ieyasu was rushed back to his residence, his staff claiming he was merely wounded, desperately ill. For weeks, the body was kept hidden. The official story held that the regent was recovering, issuing orders from his sickbed, his iron grip still firmly around the throat of the nation. But the truth, like the stain of blood that day, would not wash away. Every samurai in Edo knew what had happened. They knew the head of the great regent was gone. The Sakuradaman incident was more than an assassination. It was the moment the steel spine of the shogunate was broken, snapped by the very forces of unforgiving traditionalism it had tried to crush. The long sleep of the Tokugawa dynasty was officially over. A new, terrifying era of vengeance and political chaos had begun, one the young, weak shogun himself was utterly powerless to stop. The walls of Edo Castle were still standing, but the silence and the steel that held Japan together had failed. A terrifying, unstoppable cascade had begun. The official lie served only to buy time. Time for the fear to solidify into a cold, absolute vengeance. The loyalists, the men who had served under the dead regent, now scrambled frantically for control. They did not mourn the man Ieyasu had been. They simply sharpened their swords. The hunt for the 18 conspirators began immediately. This was not a search for justice, but a public demand for a theatrical, bloody example. Every domain, every small lord that had dared to shelter even a single conspirator was now marked for destruction. The Tokugawa machine, built on 2 centuries of flawless, unchallenged authority, was beginning to devour itself. It had ceased to function as a government of law. It had devolved into a fractured, desperate war cabinet, driven by paranoia and pure spite. With the steel spine the shogunate broken, the power rushed out of Edo like a severed artery. It flowed not into the hands of a new, strong regent, but upward. Upward toward the ancient, moss-covered city of Kyoto. For generations, the imperial court had been nothing more than a ghost, a ceremonial relic locked away in a gilded, artistic cage. The emperor, a figure of silks, poetry, and divine silence, held no political power. That was the shogun's domain. But now the radicals had a new, terrifying rallying cry. Sano joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. The assassins of Ieyasu had done more than kill a man. They had successfully woken the emperor from his long political slumber. The very men who violently hated the foreign treaties now looked past the shogun to the divine figurehead in Kyoto. They demanded he speak. They demanded he issue an official, divine condemnation of the treaties. The masterless samurai, the ronin, the chivalrous vagrants, they flocked to the imperial city. Kyoto was quickly becoming a crucible of extreme nationalism, drenched in the rhetoric of divine mandate and bloody purification. The quiet, ritualized streets of the capital, once reserved for court poetry and refined ceremony, were now patrolled by zealots with razor-sharp intent. Foreigners, shogunate officials, anyone seen as a traitor to the emperor's cause became targets in the shadows. This was the terror. It was swift, arbitrary, and absolute. The violence was no longer a consequence of policy. It was a crusade to cleanse the nation, stroke by bloody stroke. The young, weak shogun, caught in the wreckage left by his predecessor's iron will, was utterly paralyzed. He was forced to do the unthinkable. The Tokugawa Shogunate, the dynasty that had dictated every breath taken in Japan for generations, had to send desperate envoys to the imperial court. They went to Kyoto not to issue commands, but to beg for validation. The shogun asked the emperor for counsel. He asked for approval. He needed the divine backing of a man his ancestors had intentionally rendered powerless. This act, the simple, complete surrender of political primacy, was the true, fatal end of the Edo period. The great steel wall of isolation was still standing, but the foundation of power was already washed away. The shogun's authority was now on loan, and the loan was about to be called in by an unforgiving, divine creditor. The fate of the entire dynasty, the future of the nation itself, now rested on the frail, untested shoulders of an emperor who had suddenly realized the frightening, absolute power of his own voice. And the next voice he would use would not be one of diplomacy, but of command. The silence that fell over Kyoto was not the quiet of peace. It was the crushing weight before an avalanche, the profound hush that precedes an act of God. The shogun had asked for counsel. The emperor gave him a verdict. The command came not as a negotiation, but as a stroke of calligraphy. In the spring of 1863, a single, absolute scroll was issued from the imperial palace. It was brief. It was final. The decree was simple, and yet it shook the very foundations of the dynasty. Expel the barbarians. Joy. The Tokugawa policy of controlled commerce, of measured engagement with the West, was instantly denounced as a national betrayal, a stain upon the divine soil of Japan. The shogun's treaties were invalidated by pure, divine fiat. This was the answer the extremist samurai had waited a century for. The command was a flame thrown onto dry tinder. Across the nation, men who had previously been merely loud conspirators became sanctioned executioners. The movement of Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarian, had transitioned from an idea into official, murderous policy. The violence escalated immediately, moving from shadow assassinations to open, triumphant warfare. Foreigners in the treaty ports were no longer targets of shadowy ronin. They were now legal prey, enemies of the emperor himself. The streets of Yokohama and Nagasaki ran red, not with the blood of samurai rivals, but with the blood of bewildered merchants, nervous sailors, and terrified translators. The shogun, caught in the center of this storm, was utterly paralyzed. He was officially tasked with executing a policy he knew was not only impossible, but suicidal. If he obeyed the divine command, he would start a war with the great Western powers, a conflict he could not possibly win, thus destroying his own nation. If he disobeyed, he confirmed his treason against the emperor, giving his enemies, the samurai of Choshu and Satsuma, the ultimate moral and political weapon to strike him down. The Tokugawa dynasty chose the only path left to a cornered animal. It feigned. The shogun declared an official date for the total expulsion of all foreign powers, the 25th day of the 5th lunar month. It was a lie, a political tool designed to buy time to calm the religious fervor and halt the terror that he himself had unleashed by appealing to Kyoto. It was a desperate political rope trick, an attempt to appear compliant while arranging a quiet repeal. But no one was fooled. The fanatics, the young, blood-hungry samurai of the West, saw it as a victory, a promise they vowed to ensure was kept, whether the shogun intended it or not. The foreign powers, the fleets of Britain, France, and America, saw it not as a promise of removal, but as a final, catastrophic declaration of war. Across the ocean, the Western response to the emperor's divine decree was already being written. It was not written on a delicate scroll or delivered by a bowing envoy. It was written in iron and gunpowder, and it came, not from diplomacy, but from the muzzle of a gun. The moment the sun rose on the 25th day, the date the shogun had publicly named, the lie was brutally exposed. It was not the shogun's small, outdated fleet that moved. It was the enormous, modern battleships of the treaty powers. They were coming, not for trade or negotiation, but for total, brutal clarity. They sailed toward the fortified ports of the dissenting domains, intent on teaching an entire nation the price of archaic arrogance. The great steel wall of isolation was not just about to be breached. It was about to be obliterated by a fire that Japan had never known. The age of the samurai, for the first time, was staring into the cold, indifferent face of true industrial war, a force that knew nothing of honor or tradition, only destruction. And the Tokugawa shogun, the master of Japan for 200 years, stood utterly powerless, waiting for the first deafening salvo of his own dynasty's execution. The morning of the 25th was a lie, a calendar marker for a non-event that became a catastrophe. The first shots did not ring out in the great capital of Edo, where the shogun waited. They came instead from the narrow, twisting waters of the Shimonoseki Strait, hundreds of miles to the west. This was the throat of the inland sea, the vital, shimmering artery connecting East and West Japan. It was here that the fiercest anti-foreign domain, Choshu, had ignored the shogun's authority and dared to declare war on the world. Now the world had come for them. Not one ship, but 17, the assembled fleets of Britain, France, the Netherlands, and America. They formed a silent black line of steel, massive shadows against the forested mountains, utterly indifferent to the sovereignty of the coastline they approached. The Choshu defenders had cannons, yes. They were cast iron, smooth-bore relics, some of them centuries old, fired by men in traditional armor who believed the martial spirit of the samurai could withstand any shell. It was a belief that was about to be obliterated. The Western ships did not carry simple cannonballs. They carried explosive ordnance, massive armor-piercing rounds, fired from rifled guns that could reload faster than a man could shout an order. They called it the Shimonoseki campaign. For the men of Choshu, it was simply the end of the world they knew. When the first broadside fired, the sound was not a boom. It was a shattering, continuous thunder that rolled across the mountains and was heard for dozens of miles inland. The steel plates of the foreign ships shrugged off the primitive Japanese return fire, the tiny iron balls doing nothing more than chipping the paint. Their own shells, however, tore through the Choshu forts, turning earthworks, stone walls, and the bodies of the defenders into fine, white dust. The engagement lasted only 2 days. It was not a battle between two powers. It was an execution. When the smoke cleared and the foreign admirals dictated terms, the price was non-negotiable and absolute. The forts were razed. The vital waterways were opened. And the true, deep humiliation for the shogun was revealed in the final clause. The Tokugawa government, the master of Japan, was forced to pay the massive war indemnity demanded by the Western powers. They were paying for the rebellion of their own enemy domain. The shogun had not only failed to protect Japan from the outside world, he was forced to finance the destruction of his own country at the hands of those he failed to keep out. The samurai of the West saw the payment not just as an insult, but as a deep, unforgivable betrayal. The foreign powers saw it as a massive bill of sale for a nation's dignity. Japan was learning with agonizing speed that in this new world of steel and steam, honor was worthless currency. The Shimonoseki bombardment was a brutal defining lesson in physics, not politics. The fiercely xenophobic samurai, especially those in the crushed domain of Choshu and the powerful rival domain of Satsuma, stopped looking outward for the enemy. They turned their gaze inward. The enemy was no longer the Western ships. The enemy was the outdated, powerless system that could match a single modern steam engine. The enemy was the Tokugawa Shogunate itself. If the shogun could not keep the foreigners out, then the shogun must be removed. It was the only logical next step. They needed modern guns, modern ships, and a modern idea of Japan, and the only way to get them was to overthrow the dynasty that enforced 200 years of archaic isolation. This desperate, singular need led to a quiet, epic-making conspiracy, forged in the shadowed hallways of Kyoto and financed by the spoils of foreign trade, the Sacho Alliance. The two great, blood-sworn enemy domains, Satsuma and Choshu, who had fought each other for generations, had finally found common ground in mutual hatred and a shared vision of a modern future. They were no longer fighting the West. They were uniting to fight the shogun. The final, fatal civil war for the soul of Japan had just been greenlit. It would be waged in the emperor's name, but with Western rifles, and it would end the silence forever. The alliance they forged was a pact sealed not in blood oaths or shared tradition, but in gunpowder. They traded the two swords of the samurai for the mass-produced, repeating rifle. The men who led this revolution, Seigo Takamori of Satsuma, the stoic general with the common touch, and Kaido Takeyoshi of Choshu, the brilliant, ruthless strategist, became the architects of a sudden, violent future. They knew that this war would not be won by adherence to Bushido, but by logistics, organization, and superior firepower. The alliance was a cold calculation. They understood that Western powers did not respect an army of individual heroes. They respected an army of geometric lines, drilled in formation, and armed with the latest European metallurgy. While the shogunate still clung to the weight of history, the Sacho forces were looking forward, training their men not in the way of the katana, but in the efficiency of the modern infantry square. Facing them was the final shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man trapped inside the collapsing machinery of his own 260-year-old dynasty. Yoshinobu was perhaps the most modern mind the Tokugawa family had ever produced, yet he was bound by the very system he ruled. He saw the inevitable tide rushing in. He understood the fundamental flaw of the Bakufu. It could command loyalty, but it could no longer command authority. In a final, desperate gambit to prevent a full civil war, he made a staggering move. He sought to voluntarily surrender his authority, the political rule, back to the emperor. This act, known as Taizei Hakken, was not true submission. It was a political masterpiece, an attempt to defang the rebels' cause by dissolving the shogunate before they could overthrow it. He hoped to transition the Tokugawa into a dominant political force within a new, unified government run under the imperial family's banner. He tried to dismantle the old world to save a piece of it. But the forces arrayed against him had gone too far. For Seigo and Kaido, the goal was not reform, nor political compromise. Their motive was not a new balance of power. Their motive was annihilation. They needed to cleanse the land of the Tokugawa name forever to prove their own legitimacy to the world. The response to the shogun's surrender was swift, brutal, and irreversible. On the third day of the first month of 1868, the Sacho alliance seized the imperial palace in Kyoto, locking the young Emperor Meiji within their control. Then came the terrifying, epic-making decree that shook Japan to its core, the formal declaration of the restoration of imperial rule, the Osai Fuko. It was a document less than a page long, issued in the name of a boy emperor, but it instantly vaporized over 260 years of Tokugawa governance. The shogunate was not defeated. It was declared to have never existed. In the eyes of the new imperial court, the Tokugawa clan was now a private house, stripped of all titles, land, and power. They were simply rebels waiting for an excuse to strike. Seeing his political maneuvering fail completely, Shogun Yoshinobu finally moved his troops south toward Kyoto. His stated purpose was not to invade, but to purge the evil council surrounding the emperor. It was a thinly veiled invasion of the imperial capital, and the spark the alliance had been waiting for. The clash began at Toba and Fushimi, on the southern outskirts of Kyoto. This was the true moment where the rhetoric of ancient tradition met the harsh reality of the modern battlefield. The shogunal forces, vast in number but still clinging to feudal banners and traditional organization, faced the Sacho army, who were drilled, centralized, and equipped with the latest Enfield and Snider rifles. The battle was short, swift, and completely decisive. The clash was an instant, brutal referendum on modernization. The shogun's samurai forces broke ranks, terrified by the unrelenting volume of rifle fire. They were rooted. The military power that had maintained the Great Peace for generations was simply melted away by superior tactics and metallurgy. As the shogunal forces recoiled in shock and disarray, the ultimate symbol of legitimacy was unfurled over the Sacho lines, the Nishiki no Mihata, the official imperial banner of silk and gold. This flag was not just a symbol of the emperor, it was a divine sanction. To fight against it was no longer civil war. To fight against that flag was to commit treason against heaven itself. The shogun's army was instantly transformed from the government's soldiers into the enemy of the gods, and the war for the soul of Japan had just begun its relentless, unforgiving march north toward the Tokugawa heartland. The air of sanctity had vanished. The Tokugawa loyalists were no longer soldiers of a legitimate government. They were outlaws of the divine. Their shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, watched the unraveling of 260 years of peace from his private castle in Osaka. Faced with the total, horrifying collapse of his military power, He made a fatal, unforgivable decision. He chose flight. Not a proper, tactical retreat, but an outright escape, abandoning his remaining troops and sailing back to the capital of Edo with only his personal guard. The ultimate symbol of authority had become the ultimate symbol of cowardice. The news of his desertion fractured the loyalty of his armies completely. Why fight for a cause the leader himself had already abandoned? The great structure of the shogunate was not defeated by a battle, but by a whisper of fear from the very top. The imperial army, smelling the blood of victory, did not hesitate. Their advance was relentless, a great wave of modern steel sweeping north toward the Kanto plain. Their target, Edo. The stage was set for a catastrophe. Edo was the largest city in the world, the jewel of the Tokugawa peace, its population exceeding 1 million souls. The city was defenseless, its walls crumbling, its remaining samurai forces scattered and demoralized. A siege would have meant the total annihilation of the city, the destruction of an entire civilization simply to bring down the final banner of the shogun. A humanitarian disaster loomed, a pyre that would consume 1 million lives. The entire war now hinged on the courage of one man and the mercy of another. The man who sought to save the city was Katsukaishu, the pragmatic and visionary shogunal navy minister. He knew that saving the inhabitants was more important than saving the dynasty. He faced Seigo Takamori, the ruthless, brilliant commander of the imperial forces. They met in quiet rooms, away from the drums of war. Katsu offered a complete, unconditional surrender. "Give us peace," he pleaded, "or you will gain nothing but a ruined capital." Seigo was a man of the mountains, hard and unyielding. He had the power to burn Edo to ash and would have been fully justified by the laws of war. Yet he listened. He understood the strategic horror of his victory and the global condemnation a massacre would bring. The agreement was reached, a compromise forged in the shadow of mass destruction. Edo Castle, the very heart of the Tokugawa Empire, was peacefully handed over to the imperial side. The great peace was over, but the great city was saved. But the surrender of the capital was not the end of the war. It was merely the end of the beginning. Not every loyalist accepted this quiet defeat. A fierce core of Tokugawa retainers, men who saw the shogun's surrender as an act of profound betrayal, refused to lay down their swords. They were samurai of the old order, men for whom honor was blood, not negotiation. Led by Inamoto Taikaki, who commanded the most modern fleet the shogunate possessed, they broke the peace and sailed out of Edo Bay. They took with them a final, desperate army, a last remnant of the old world, carrying the banner of the shogun toward the wildest, most unforgiving lands of the north. They were sailing into the unknown, ready to carve a new, final, independent realm out of the ice and silence. Their refusal to yield, their defiant rejection of the very tide of history, would lead them to a final, tragic destiny on the northern island. A destiny where the last flames of the old Japan would flicker and die. The 6 ships of Inamoto's fleet cut north, black silhouettes against the coming winter sea. They were carrying more than men. They carried the dying breath of 3 centuries. The deck beneath their feet was a shifting, uncertain ground, but it was a ground chosen by honor. For these last loyalists, surrender was a crime against their ancestors. They believed the true Japan was not in the negotiated peace of Edo, but in the cold defiance of the sea. Inamoto Taikaki, a brilliant naval mind schooled in Dutch maritime science, was an architect of the future who had chosen to serve the past. He guided them toward Izo, the great northern wilderness, a place the shogun himself had barely tamed. It was an exodus, silent and determined, carrying the full, tragic weight of the old world toward its final destination. In the harsh, unfamiliar bay of Hakodate, they finally made landfall. Their first act was to seize Goryakaku, a colossal, 5-pointed, star-shaped fortress, a perfect, modern symbol of European military engineering. It was a geometry of defense, utterly alien to the ancient castles of Japan. And within those walls, they did something unprecedented. These samurai of the old order did not establish a feudal domain. They held an election. In a desperate, paradoxical act, they sought to legitimize their rebellion with the very tools of Western modernity they were fighting to hold back. They voted by majority rule, a concept that shattered the very foundation of the shogunate they claimed to defend. Inamoto Taikaki was voted president, or Sasai. This was the birth of the Republic of Ieyasu, the first and only republic ever declared on Japanese soil. For 4 short months, this strange new nation existed. It became a sanctuary, a magnet for every ronin, every defeated retainer, every man who believed the Meiji restoration was not a renewal, but a profound betrayal of the national spirit. Among them was Hijikata Toshizo, the terrifying demon vice-commander of the Shinsengumi, a man whose legend was already written in blood and absolute loyalty. He saw Ieyasu not as a republic, but as the final, pure ground for the ancient warrior code. He took control of the republic's defenses, preparing a siege as hard and unforgiving as his own heart. The banner of the shogun's loyalists flew high over Goryakaku, an insult and an open wound to the new imperial government in Tokyo. Tokyo, however, was not blinded by the snow. The new Meiji state could not tolerate a rival nation, especially one founded on such flagrant defiance and led by the shogun's modern fleet. The Republic of Ieyasu was a symbol that had to be utterly and totally erased. The cold, brutal northern winter was the only thing protecting the rebels, freezing the Tsugaru Strait and holding the imperial fleet at bay. The snow was their only true shield, their temporary ally against the tide of history. But the winter cannot last forever. As the months turned and the snows began their slow, inevitable melt, the imperial army began gathering its strength. They were building a massive invasion force, modern and ruthless, preparing to cross the strait and reclaim the nation's entire northern domain. The samurai in the Star Fortress were waiting. They knew what was coming for them. The grand experiment, the desperate dream of a new loyalist Japan, was about to face its final, inevitable reckoning. The silence of the north was broken not by the cries of battle, but by the sound of the ice groaning as it broke apart in the spring thaw, a sound that meant the end of all things. The sea, once the protector, became the highway for vengeance. The imperial fleet, sleek and black, now moved unimpeded across the Tsugaru Strait. They were the visible tide of a new era, guns trained not on foreign foes but on the last vestiges of their own past. For centuries, the samurai had been defined by their sword and their honor. Now they were to be undone by steam and iron. Inside the Goryakaku Star Fortress, the grand experiment was already collapsing from within. Admiral Inamoto had gathered a dedicated force, but dedication cannot feed an army. The ground was poor, the northern cold had sapped their strength, and the supplies were running out. The defenders were fewer than 4,000 men, facing a modern imperial invasion force 3 times their size, armed with the latest Western rifles. The dream of a pure samurai state had devolved into a grim waiting game. They were cornered, trapped by their own rigid loyalty to a dead cause, forced to watch the horizon thicken with the sails of their executioners. The imperial landing began not with a grand naval confrontation, but with a swift, punishing stroke on the island's southern shores. They came ashore not in ranks of spearmen, but in waves of disciplined, rifle-bearing infantry, shattering the small, scattered outposts of the shogun's remaining loyalists. The battle for Ieyasu was not a calculated siege, it was an extermination. The rebels were pushed back, mile by agonizing mile, until the only ground left beneath their feet was the city of Hakodate, and finally, the single, symbolic point of the Goryakaku fortress. The world of the Tokugawa loyalists narrowed to this 5-pointed enclosure. All that remained of the shogun's dream was the acrid powder smoke and the freezing mud inside the star's defensive walls. The fortress was designed for perfect defense, but its elegant shape now seemed to mock them, a perfect geometric trap for a final, catastrophic defeat. The imperial batteries were set up on the surrounding hills, elevated and unseen, pouring fire into the center of the star. They did not need to storm the walls yet. They were simply erasing the space inside. The earth trembled without pause, the inner compound shook with every explosion, and the elegant, new Western-style buildings the Loyalists had erected were reduced to burning splinters. They were running low on rice, on gunpowder, and on the strength required to stand. Every moment was a fresh, deafening hell. Admiral Inamoto, refusing to yield the honor of the shogun's flag even in this last hour, made one final, desperate, poetic gesture. He gathered the only remaining symbols of their true worth, the complete records of their naval service, painstakingly kept. He sent the documents outside the walls to the imperial commander, requesting that their lives be spared for the good of the new Japan, arguing that their skill and loyalty could be turned to the nation's benefit. But the answer came back in the form of intensified shelling, not diplomacy. The new age had no use for old honors, only new loyalty. The message was clear. There was no bargain to be struck with treason. The final assault was inevitable. The relentless bombardment suddenly ceased, and the ensuing silence was worse than the noise. It meant the time for talking was over. The imperial army began to march, preparing to storm the walls in the deep, cold hours before the first light. The 4,000 loyalists knew they would not survive the dawn. They prepared their swords not for victory, but for the perfect, final death that the warrior code demanded. This was the true end of the samurai age, about to be written in the metallic scent of blood yet to be spilled. The great wooden gate of the Goryakaku Star Fortress groaned on its hinges. It was about to fall. The gate did not simply fall. It exploded inward in 1,000 splinters. The silence was instantly replaced by the scream of 4,000 doomed men and the awful, wet sound of steel meeting bone. This was not a battle for victory. It was a ritual of final, terrible fidelity. Through the breach rushed the wave of the new order, dressed in uniforms that looked more European than samurai, bearing rifles that spat fire and death from a distance no sword could ever hope to bridge. The battle lasted only hours, a brutal, meaningless collision between the past and the future. For the loyalists of the Tokugawa, their honor was the shogun's name, a name that had guaranteed 2 centuries of absolute stillness, 2 centuries where the great world outside had simply ceased to exist for them. Their ancestors had built a perfect box of peace, and this, the final, desperate struggle, was the penalty for keeping that box sealed for too long. The story of the Tokugawa is the story of a perfect dream of isolation. The first shogun, Ieyasu, had seen Japan burn in 100 civil wars. He had watched the warlords tear the land apart until nothing was left but smoke and hunger, a century of slaughter known as the Age of the Warring States. His ultimate vision was a peace so profound, so complete, that it would become suffocating. He and his successors engineered it with the careful, cold brilliance of a master watchmaker. First, they eliminated all rivals. Then, they drew a line around the entire country. The borders were closed. The great ships that could sail across the wide ocean were burned and replaced with small, coastal vessels, ensuring no Japanese citizen could ever leave. No foreign influence could ever truly enter. They exiled the priests, expelled the merchants, and killed the few who dared to question the rule. Only one tiny, artificial island in Nagasaki harbor was left open to a handful of Dutch traders, acting as a window so small it was more like a pinhole. This was the policy of Sakoku, the sealed country. It was an iron peace, enforced by the chilling, ritualized power of the samurai class, whose purpose changed from fighting wars to enforcing compliance. Swords were kept sharp, but only for maintaining the tranquility, not for any true conflict. The nation was locked down, and for 260 years the policy worked. It was an unnatural silence. Japan slept, wrapped in the silken, iron-threaded dream of the shogun's rule. Generations were born and died believing that the boundaries of their island were the boundaries of the entire universe. But the world outside was wide awake. It was industrialized, it was hungry. The Tokugawa rulers had mistaken a policy for an eternal truth. They believed that if they did not look at the world would not look back. The first tremor came in 1853. Not in a diplomatic note, not in a whispered rumor, but in a sound that had not existed in the world for 2 centuries. The deep, heavy, relentless turning of a machine. Off the coast of Edo Bay, where the shogun's castle sat in its untouchable glory, 4 great black silhouettes loomed through the morning fog. They were ships made not of wood and sail, but of iron and smoke. They belonged to no empire Japan recognized, and they moved with a menacing, mechanical power that defied the old laws of the sea. Commodore Matthew Perry had arrived, carrying a message that changed everything. His guns were not aimed at a specific fortress, but at the very concept of the Tokugawa peace. The shogun's perfect, silent box had been delivered its first, devastating blow. The future of the samurai was suddenly, and violently, up for debate, and the question of how to answer the West would tear the dynasty apart from the inside out. The long peace was over. The choice was now simple: fight or surrender the soul of Japan. The guns fell silent, but the shockwaves kept moving. The 4 black ships had done more than land a foreign envoy. They had instantly, brutally, undone 200 years of political and spiritual engineering. The sound of the steam engine was the sound of the shogun's authority collapsing. Fear gripped Edo, a paralyzing, cold thing that wrapped around the hearts of the great counselors. They were men of meticulous ritual, of layered bureaucracy, men who ruled by the force of ancient law. They were utterly, tragically unequipped for an ultimatum backed by iron. The shogun, a title already distant and largely symbolic, received Perry's demand. It was a letter wrapped in diplomatic silk, but carrying the weight of a war that Japan could not possibly win. They had no modern navy, no coastal defenses, and a standing army drilled in the obsolete techniques of the 17th century. The council debated in an agony of shame and indecision. Every option was a form of treason. To fight was to invite the total destruction of the nation, the burning of the capital, the end of the sacred land. To yield was to destroy the Bakufu itself, to admit to the entire world and to every last samurai that the great Tokugawa peace was nothing but a fragile, failed illusion. They chose the slow death. Perry returned, reinforced, and his threat became reality. In 1854, the Convention of Kanagawa was signed. The ports were thrown open. The ritual fence of iron and silence that had defined the nation was shattered by a single stroke of a quill. The news spread, not like a diplomatic note, but like a plague of dishonor. The treaty was a physical wound on the pride of every true believer in the samurai code. They watched as the foreigners, with their strange, arrogant confidence and their disregard for custom, walked onto the sacred soil of Nippon. Humiliation was not a sudden event. It was a daily, grinding reality, visible in every port and every new trade agreement. Out in the distant, powerful domains, especially Choshu and Satsuma, this shame did not breed paralysis. It became a sharp, violent, unforgiving heat. The cry that erupted from these peripheral clans was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of war against both the foreigners and the weak men who had let them in. The call was Sano Joy: revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. For 2 centuries, the emperor in Kyoto had been a holy, silent icon, a symbol removed from the grubby reality of governance. Now, he was the only remaining pure banner, the only legitimate source of power left to rally under. This was the death blow to the shogunate. It was no longer just about trade. It was a direct challenge to the fundamental right of the Tokugawa to rule. The loyalty of the samurai class, the very steel spine of the Bakufu, began to fracture like old lacquerware. The young, the passionate, the ideological began to see the shogun not as a guardian, but as a traitor, a weakling who had bowed to the steel of the West. These men became the shishi, the men of high purpose. They were assassins, revolutionaries. They targeted the diplomats, the translators, the foreign merchants, but more crucially, they targeted the shogun's own officials and counselors. The streets of Kyoto, so long quiet and reserved, began to run with the blood of political murder. The shogun's dynasty was being destroyed, not by distant cannon fire, but by the betrayal of its own most disillusioned sons. The Tokugawa tried to enforce their will, but the mandate of heaven had perceptibly shifted. Their men were fighting ghosts, men who believed that the true spirit of Japan could only be saved by burning the entire corrupt order down. The isolationist dream was over. The perfect silence had become a civil war's screaming chaos, and the great samurai families who had carved out the peace were now reaching for their swords to tear the nation apart. The final reckoning was about to begin. The final reckoning demanded a new authority, a symbol of purity that stood above the corruption of the Tokugawa treaties. The assassins, the shishi, had the blood of revolution on their hands, but they lacked the legal parchment of God's will. They needed a banner older than the peace, a name that could not be stained by foreign mud. That name belonged to the man who slept in his gilded cage in Kyoto, the emperor. For 2.5 centuries, the imperial court had been a relic, a fountain of poetry and ritual, powerless in any practical sense. But now, the revolutionaries draped the emperor in the banner of divine right and demanded absolute fidelity. The rallying cry was simple, absolute, and terrifying to the shogun: Sano joy. Revere the emperor, expel the barbarian. This single phrase gave the revolutionary factions the moral high ground and turned the shogun's attempts at diplomacy into open treason. The Tokugawa could no longer command loyalty because they had forsaken the emperor's divine silence. Yet the true engine of this upheaval did not lie in the court's frail politics, but in the powerful, resentful clans on the periphery, the Tazama Daimyo. These were the great lords who had been denied the inner circles of power since the first shogun, Ieyasu. Two regions, geographically distant and ideologically opposed, stood ready to seize the moment. Satsuma in the far south was a rugged, militaristic domain, hardened by poverty and ambition. They were led by men who knew only loyalty to their own clan and an instinct for expansion. The other was Choshu, on the western end of Honshu, a hotbed of intellectual fury and the fiercest anti-foreign ideology in Japan. Their soldiers were driven by a fanatic belief that they alone could restore the nation's honor. These two powers, Satsuma and Choshu, were traditional, ancient enemies, separated by generations of feuding and mistrust. But the common, burning hatred for the Tokugawa Shogunate proved stronger than any old blood feud. A secret alliance was sealed in darkness, a pact that was not just about sharing power, but about destroying the entire political structure of the last 3 centuries. This was the Sacho Alliance. Against this rising storm stood the new and last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu. Yoshinobu was a brilliant man, modern in his outlook, and fully aware that the system was collapsing. He saw that the shogunate could not be saved by fighting, it could only be saved by surrender. In a desperate tactical move that stunned the nation, he formally yielded his authority back to the emperor. This was the Taizei Hakken, the great restoration of power. Yoshinobu's intention was to dissolve the old government, then reform a new council where the Tokugawa clan would still hold immense sway. A retreat, not a defeat. But the Sacho alliance was not interested in a tactical retreat. They wanted annihilation. The revolutionaries immediately twisted the emperor's hand and issued a new decree, declaring that Shogun Yoshinobu was not merely retiring, but was a traitor who must be crushed completely. The vast estates and lands of the Tokugawa must be seized. The armies of Satsuma and Choshu, now wearing the colors of the imperial cause, marched on Kyoto. The final reckoning was upon them. In January of 1868, just outside the ancient capital, the last modern army of the Tokugawa Shogunate met the forces of the alliance at Toba-Fushimi. The shogun's men were armed with French rifles, trained by Dutch experts, and were technically superior. But the Satsuma and Choshu ranks carried something far more potent than gunpowder. They carried the divine mandate. When the sacred brocade banner of the emperor was raised over the field of battle for the first time in centuries, a symbol used only for the imperial commander, it broke the very soul of the shogunal troops. They were no longer fighting rebels. They were fighting the gods themselves. The shogunal lines shattered. 3 days after the first shots were fired, the battle was lost. The dynasty that had ruled Japan for over 250 years was decapitated. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, fled his own army in the dead of night, sailing back to his capital in Edo in absolute disgrace, abandoning his men and his mandate. The silent age of the samurai had ended in a scream, and the civil war was just beginning its bloody march toward the final, crushing fall. The flight of the last shogun did not buy him peace, it only bought him shame. The imperial army, the Toseigun, the punitive force of the East, did not stop to savor the victory at Toba-Fushimi. They pressed the chase. Their banner, woven with the sacred imperial chrysanthemum, now flew over a land that was being quickly stripped of its loyalties. Their destination was the ultimate prize, the heart of the enemy, Edo. The city of 1,000,000 souls, the seat of Tokugawa power for 2.5 centuries, was now facing the purifying fire of the imperial cause. Panic flooded the great city. The feudal lords who had sworn loyalty to the shogun now swore loyalty to the rising son of the emperor. Streets once filled with the endless commerce of a long peace emptied, replaced by streams of terrified refugees and desperate men forming defense militias. The shogun himself was a spent force. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the man who had inherited the greatest military dictatorship in Japanese history, refused to fight. He chose seclusion in Ueno, abandoning the defense to his most capable retainer, a brilliant naval strategist named Katsu Kaishu. Katsu was not a general of armies. He was a politician of consequence. He knew that the war was already lost on the fields of honor and faith. The new battle was for the soul and the infrastructure of Japan. On the opposite side, leading the spear point of the imperial advance, was the one man capable of matching him, the quiet giant of Satsuma, Seigo Takamori. The two men stood opposite each other, not across a battlefield but across a vast, impossible chasm of history. One held the past, the other, the future. Seigo's mission, given by the ambitious young emperor's court, was simple: crush the Tokugawa completely. His army was ready to storm the outer walls of Edo Castle, ready to purify the capital in blood and flame. Katsu Kaishu knew the true price of resisting. He walked the high stone walls of Edo Castle, gazing out at the endless expanse of wooden houses built by his ancestors. A battle fought within this city would not be a mere military defeat. It would be an atrocity. The destruction of the capital, the massacre of its populace, the undoing of 200 years of Tokugawa Pax. The price of a final, defiant stand was the sacrifice of the very people the shogunate was sworn to protect. He sent word to Seigo, a secret meeting, a desperate plea. The stakes were no longer who ruled Japan, but whether the beating heart of Japan would survive the transition. Katsu met Seigo in the stillness of the temple grounds outside the city. They were generals, but they spoke as citizens. They were enemies, but they shared a common dread of fire and ruin. Katsu offered everything: the shogun's complete surrender, the entire armory, the treasury, the keys to the castle itself. He offered the complete, humiliating end of the dynasty. Seigo held the executioner's axe. He could order the final assault and earn eternal glory as the man who crushed the last remnant of the shogunate. Or he could grant mercy and secure a new, peaceful order. The imperial army waited, fingers on their triggers, watching the eastern gate. The shogun's forces waited inside, prepared for the glorious, final suicide of the samurai age. All of history, all the silence and all the violence of the last 2 centuries, hinged upon the conversation of 2 men. The final assault was scheduled for the 15th day of March. They had only days left to decide. Would the dynasty end with a whimper of peace, or the catastrophic roar of a burning capital? Edo Castle waited for the rising sun. The final day of negotiations was not marked by shouts or anger, but by a chilling, profound quiet. 2 men, sitting across a low table, trying to save a civilization from its own violent rebirth. Katsu looked not at Seigo, the general, but past him, to the ghosts of 260 years of Tokugawa rule. He saw the fire that had consumed Osaka. He saw the smoking ruins of Kyoto's final stand. He knew the playbook of total war. He knew what Edo, a city of over 1 million souls, would look like after the new artillery had done its work. The shogunate, born in blood, had secured its reign by sealing the land and silencing all dissent. Its greatest achievement was peace, the long Pax Tokugawa. The cruelest irony would be for that peace to end in the greatest, most devastating violence Japan had ever known. Katsu's voice was steady, a low, reasoned plea that cut through the silence of the temple garden. He was not asking for the life of the shogun. He was not asking for the continuation of the dynasty. That was a lost cause, a debt already paid. He was asking for the life of the city. He argued that to crush Edo and massacre its citizens would be to build the new, modern Japan on a foundation of ashes and bitter, unending resentment. This would be a victory stained so dark, it would poison the Meiji restoration before it even drew its first breath. "Take the castle," he pleaded. "Take the power, the money, the keys, the surrender. Take everything. But spare the people who have lived under the peace you claim to desire. End the dynasty, but do not burn the legacy of 2 centuries." Seigo Takamori listened, impassive, his posture the perfect, unreadable stillness of the master swordsman. He was the sword of the emperor. He was the perfect loyalist. He had been given the clearest possible order: crush the rebellion, execute the remnants. Yet he had climbed the ladder of power not by cruelty, but by a deep, revolutionary vision. He was not a general who merely obeyed. He was a statesman who dreamt of a new Japan, and a statesman could not justify the immolation of the very capital he sought to liberate. To sign the treaty was to accept Katsu's humiliation, a bitter negotiate. End instead of the glorious, clean conquest the imperial army demanded. To refuse was to unleash the full, terrifying power of the imperial forces and accept responsibility for the bloodbath to come. The executioner held the axe, but the weight of the axe was not the weight of the victim's neck, but the weight of the entire nation's future. The sun set on the 14th day of March. The answer was not yet given. In the streets of Edo, the quiet was heavier than any storm. The residents knew. They had heard the whispers, seen the movement of troops. They shuttered their windows and bolted their doors, hiding their children in the deepest rooms, waiting for the sound of the first cannon shot that would announce the end of their world. Inside the great castle, the shogun's men stood guard. Their uniforms were clean, their spirits resigned. They had prepared their final prayers. They had chosen their final armor. They were ready for the suicide charge that would mark the final, bloody punctuation mark of the samurai age. For them, Death in defense of the shogun was the only honorable exit. Seigo's deadline remained absolute, the morning of the 15th. When the sun finally began to rise, painting the sky with the pale, sickly yellow of dawn, every imperial soldier positioned outside the eastern gate held his breath. Their fingers rested on triggers. The drummers who held the signal sticks watched the general's tent, waiting for the wave of the hand that would unleash the signal cannon. The light grew stronger. The moment came. The moment passed. All of history, all the peace of 2 centuries, all the dread of the burning capital, hung suspended in that single, unbearable silence. Did the cannon fire? Did the gates burst open to the sound of battle? Did the final assault begin? No. The sound was not the boom of a cannon, but something far more fragile. It was the sound of a choice. A decision made hours earlier, in a quiet room far removed from the stench of gunpowder and the readiness for slaughter. The man who made that choice was Katsu Kaishu, the shogun's naval minister. He was an outsider in the feudal world, a modernist who saw past the edge of his own sword. He looked at the great wooden city of Edo, the heart of 200 years of peace, and saw not a fortress to defend, but a civilization to save. He alone possessed the clarity to speak a language the old samurai could not understand: surrender. Days before the ultimate deadline, he had met with his counterpart, the relentless General Seigo Takamori, at a contested, muddy tea-house nestled between the 2 armies. The scene was simple: a low table, 2 cups of bitter tea, and the weight of the entire nation pressing down on the silence between them. They were not generals arguing strategy. They were historians debating the cost of legacy. Katsu looked Seigo in the eyes and did not beg for the shogun's life, but for the life of the city. He argued that to burn Edo was to burn the future of Japan. It was the repository of all the knowledge, all the wealth, and all the fragile peace the Tokugawa had created. To destroy it for the sake of one final, glorious samurai death was madness. Seigo, the man who commanded the execution, was also the son of the impoverished South, a poet and a scholar of tradition. He understood the honor of the charge, but he also understood the suffering of the peasantry. He saw the fire Katsu spoke of. He saw the innocent blood. The deal they struck was agonizing, profound, and simple. The Tokugawa shogun, the absolute ruler of Japan, must surrender unconditionally. He must vacate the castle and submit to the new imperial authority. His forces must lay down every blade, every rifle, every symbol of their ancient right to rule. In exchange for this total humiliation, the city of Edo would be spared. No cannon would fire. No samurai would die in defense of the gate. It was an impossible price, a stain on the honor of every warrior who stood ready to die. It demanded the men of the shogun choose dishonor over death, a choice the samurai code did not allow. But the choice was made. Katsu, authorized by the shogun himself, sent the final confirmation to Seigo's tent late on the night of the 14th. And so, when the sun finally did rise on the morning of the 15th, painting the great castle walls with that pale, sickly yellow, the imperial troops outside the eastern gate did not hear the signal cannon. They heard the sound of General Seigo's calm voice pass down the line of command. The order was simple: stand down. The moment passed, the silence remained. The samurai in their prepared final armor did not charge. They did not die. They waited, swords gripped, listening to the crushing silence of their failure, of their survival. The absolute end of the Tokugawa Shogunate arrived not with a thunderous war cry, but with a whisper of administrative surrender. The greatest city in the world was Ved, the war in the capital was over. But not every man under the shogun's banner could stomach that betrayal. Not every warrior could accept a peaceful life when they had already chosen a glorious death. For the most loyal, for the fiercely traditional samurai, the surrender of Edo was not an act of saving the future. It was an act of profound, unforgivable cowardice. The peace won in the tea house was a phantom. It merely pushed the war from the heart of the nation and into the dark, uncharted wilderness. It saved the buildings, but it could not save the bitter, burning honor of the warrior class. If they could not die defending Edo, they would take the fight and their doomed loyalty somewhere else. They would take it to the cold, distant north. The gates to the castle might have opened peacefully, but the war for Japan was far from finished. The surrender was a wound to the soul, deeper and more profound than any clean sword cut. It was a poison that traveled through the ranks of the loyalists, forcing an impossible choice: to live in shame or to die in a war that no longer existed. For many, the world they knew had simply vanished beneath their feet. The shogun had not fallen in a climactic battle, but dissolved into paperwork. These were men who had defined their entire existence by loyalty to a single banner, by the code of Bushido that valued a glorious, timely death above all else. They were now ghosts in their own capital. They refused the ghost life. A core group, the most fanatical, refused to disband. They gathered in the ancient shadows of Ueno, near the great family temples of the Tokugawa. They called themselves the Shogutai, the core for clarifying the will of the shogun. Their purpose was no longer to win the war, but to make a loud, desperate statement of pure defiance. They were not an army. They were a funeral pyre for the old regime, and they sought only the perfect final flame. The imperial forces, the newly crowned victors of the bloodless capital, could not tolerate this open, burning disrespect so close to their fragile new seat of power. If the Tokugawa Shogunate had been extinguished with a whisper, this resistance required a shout. The confrontation came in the late spring of 1868. The Battle of Ueno Hill was not a siege, it was an execution. The imperial army brought the heavy, cruel geometry of Western warfare to the temple grounds. Cannons tore through the stillness of the dawn. The samurai of the Shogutai fought with the traditional fury of men who knew they were already dead, charging forward with swords against the relentless hail of modern Western rifles. The fighting lasted only a few brutal hours. The Shogutai were obliterated. The grand temples and the surrounding forest were swallowed by fire, turned into a vast, smoking pyre that cast a terrible, cleansing light across the capital. When the smoke cleared, all that remained of the greatest challenge to the imperial cause in the capital was ash and silence. The surviving loyalists were violently ejected from the Kanto region. They had nowhere to go but out of the civilized lands, out of the spring warmth, and into the unforgiving, distant cold. The road led north. They were fleeing a world that had rejected their honor, carrying nothing but their swords and the tattered, burning memory of the Tokugawa banner. Their pilgrimage was a desperate search for allies, for a patch of ground still frozen enough to hold their loyalty. They marched toward the deep northern domains, toward the powerful Ieyasu clan, who remained the iron heart of shogunal tradition and resistance. But it was not just a handful of disgraced warriors who found themselves marching toward the snow-capped mountains. The northern domain lords, gazing down at the chaos and the new, brutal zealotry of the imperial campaign, saw not a liberation, but a hostile, southern invasion. They saw the end of their ancient rights. In the face of the encroaching imperial army, 25 northern domains did the unthinkable. They put aside generations of rivalry, of bitter feud, and banded together. They formed a military and political pact that unified the entire, vast spine of the northern territories. They named it the Oetsu Reppendomai, the Northern Coalition. The imperial banner had crushed a band of rebels on a small hill in the city. Now, it faced a coordinated, hardened, freezing army stretching across the wilderness. The peace won in Edo was exposed for the fragile, cynical lie that it was. The greatest city had been saved, but the war for Japan had only just begun. It would be fought in the snow and the mountains, against a united force willing to see the whole world burn to keep their ancient loyalties intact. The Oetsu Reppendomai was not simply an army. It was a continent of ice-bound history given the power of fire. 25 separate banners had been stitched together, bound not by a charismatic general or a single political vision, but by a shared, blinding dread. The imperial banners, forged in the heat of Kyoto and Edo, demanded a single, pure, undivided loyalty to the emperor. For centuries, the lords of the north had managed their own vast, difficult lands, paying tribute to the shogun while maintaining their own ancient, inherited rights. Now, the new government sought to sweep away this entire, complex web of tradition, replacing it with a flat, cold, centralized authority. This was not a fight for the return of the Tokugawa family. It was a fight for the soul of the feudal system itself. The North fought for the right to remain different, to maintain the complex, layered truths of the old ways. At the core of this vast, freezing defense stood the Ieyasu. The Ieyasu was the iron rod in the spine of the old order. Their lord, Matsudaira Katamari, had served the shogun with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor, and his castle town of Wakamatsu became the ultimate prize the imperial forces sought to destroy. The stakes there were existential, demanding total loyalty from every man, woman, and child who claimed Ieyasu soil. But the military strength, the cold steel confidence of the coalition, lay with the Shanai clan. The Shanai had been the last to taste victory, humiliating the imperial vanguard outside Edo, proving that the zealotry of the Southerners alone could not conquer disciplined samurai. The memory of that success fueled a belief that they truly could hold the line, that they could stop the tide of change before it froze over their entire world. The fragile peace in Edo was now revealed as a temporary, cynical truce. The new government, desperate to secure their revolution and gain international legitimacy, could not tolerate such a massive, organized resistance. This was no skirmish. It was a counter-revolution on a continental scale. They mobilized. The Imperial High Command, centered on the powerful Satsuma and Choshu domains, understood that the sheer size of the coalition was a weakness as much as a strength. A front stretching from the Pacific to the Japan Sea was too thin, too spread out. It could be broken. Their strategy was direct, brutal, and utterly focused. Punch through the center, isolate the key players, Ieyasu and Shan, and let the cold hand of winter, starvation, and betrayal finish the rest. They had to find the single, crucial gate that would unlock the North, allowing the new government's armies to pour into the heartland of the resistance. That gate was the Shirakawa Pass, the point where the central north met the warmer south. It was a choke point, a natural fortress of jagged rock and ancient pine forest, a key strategic height that commanded the main road. To lose Shirakawa meant the imperial forces would pour unchecked into the rich, central valley of the Ieyasu domains. It was the absolute, unyielding line in the snow. To protect it, the coalition had committed some of its most seasoned, loyal troops, men who were willing to die where they stood to protect the honor of the Northern Pact. The imperial column, led by the ruthless commander Toyama, marched toward the narrow valley. They carried the most modern foreign rifles and a profound, terrifying sense of destiny. The air grew still, heavy with the metallic scent of anticipation. Two vastly different visions of Japan were about to collide at this lonely, forgotten mountain pass. The drums began to beat in the valley mist. One side fighting to change everything, the other fighting to keep a world from vanishing. Neither was truly prepared for the sheer, grinding horror that was about to unfold. The battle for Shirakawa was about to begin, and it would decide if the icebound loyalties of the North would hold, or shatter the entire, desperate dream of the coalition into 1,000 bloody pieces. The dawn broke not with sun but with smoke. The still air, heavy with mist and fate, was instantly ripped apart. It began with the thin, sharp, terrible crack of 1,000 imported rifles. The imperial column did not need to announce their presence with trumpets or drums. Their technology was their herald. A devastating, sustained torrent of lead tore through the ancient pine lines. This was not the warfare of old Japan, decided by single heroic thrusts of a spear. This was modern industrial death, delivered from a distance, indifferent to courage, respecting only cover. The defenders of the north faced the storm. They held the narrow track with weapons pulled from another century. Matchlock muskets, slow to load, spitting fire and smoke that choked their own vision. They were shielded by stone walls built by their ancestors, but these walls were meant to stop men, not the relentless steel rain of the West. They stood on honor, on the icy conviction that they were the last true inheritors of the shogun's Japan. They watched their comrades fall, the sudden, terrible collapses that signaled a life instantly extinguished. Yet they held the line. They were samurai, yes, but they were also farmers and merchants, called to arms, bound by the desperate, sinking hope of the coalition. The imperial commander, Toyama, did not need complex maneuvers. He needed only patience and a steady stream of ammunition. He pressed the advantage, pouring troops onto the slopes, forcing the defenders to reveal themselves. The men in the pass were trapped in a slow-motion nightmare. They could not return fire quickly enough. For every shot they fired, the enemy fired 10. If they charged, they were mown down before they covered 50 yards of open ground. If they waited, the enemy simply leveled their meager defenses and picked them off with cold, foreign precision. The conflict devolved into a desperate, primal struggle. Bayonets met katana in the churned earth, a clash of metal that only underscored the vast gulf between their two worlds. The northern warriors, masters of the blade, found their artistry irrelevant. They were fighting shadows that killed from beyond the reach of their steel. The bodies began to pile up, a grim, rapidly growing testament to the supremacy of foreign gunpowder. The sheer, overwhelming weight of fire began to tear the cohesion from the northern ranks. The hours dragged on, each minute weighted with death. By mid-afternoon, the inevitable began to occur. The constant, terrifying pressure found its fracture point. On the far eastern flank, near the ancient watchtower, the defenses had thinned. The Sendai troops, weary and running critically low on powder, were overrun by a relentless surge of imperial troops who finally managed to scale the difficult, jagged outcrop. Once atop the ridge, the imperial forces could not be dislodged. They immediately turned their rifles, pouring devastating fire down onto the remaining, exposed defenders below. The whole line suddenly buckled. The crucial gate, the Shirakawa Pass itself, was no longer sealed. It was exposed, vulnerable, and the man commanding the pass, seeing the breach, saw not just a hole in his line but the sudden, final end of a world. The imperial forces poured through the opening, the stream becoming a torrent, surging now into the flat, rich heartland of the Ieyasu domains. The dream of the Northern Coalition, the vision of a sealed, loyal Japan, was not just threatened anymore. It was, in this moment of sheer, brutal defeat, over. The path was open. The war was coming home to Ieyasu, and nothing would ever be the same. The defeat at Shirakawa was not a tactical retreat. It was the collapse of an ideology, a sudden, violent implosion of everything the Northern Coalition stood for. What remained of the Sendai and Ieyasu command fled desperately, abandoning the high ground and the bitter snows for the flat, open valleys of the Ieyasu heartland. They rode north, not as soldiers but as grim messengers of doom, their horses lathered and their faces blank with the terror of what they had witnessed. They were racing the inevitable. They knew the imperial advance, fueled by the intoxicating taste of victory and modern gunpowder, would be swift and merciless. For months, the people of the Ieyasu domain had lived with the quiet, rigid confidence of the samurai caste. Their capital, Wakamatsu, was secure. Their ancestral castle, Tsurugajo, was strong. Shirakawa was the shield. Now that shield lay in pieces upon a bloody ridge. In Wakamatsu Castle, the news arrived not with a cannon shot but as a dull, sickening thud, a sound heard only in the soul. The capital, which had always felt like the impenetrable center of the Tokugawa world, was suddenly, horrifyingly exposed. The thousands of women and children who had been sheltered within the outer walls, waiting for fathers and husbands to return from the distant frontier, now had to face the reality of the front line arriving on their doorstep. This was not the kind of war they had prepared for. For generations, the samurai code had defined their entire existence: unwavering loyalty, stoic preparation, and a life lived and ended with honor. But the samurai world had made a fatal error. It had never truly accounted for total war, a war that did not respect the separation between the warrior and the hearth. The domain lord, Matsudaira Katamari, a man defined by his absolute devotion to the collapsing shogunate, now faced the ultimate, impossible choice: surrender his entire world and be publicly shamed, or fight a final, unwinnable defense that would cost every life in his capital and erase his family line from the map of Japan. The desperation became a horrifying necessity. The last hope of the Ieyasu domain was not the grizzled veterans who had fallen at the pass, but its children. The White Tiger Force, the Byakutai, were mobilized. Boys aged from 15 down to barely 16 years old, their swords feeling too heavy in their hands, their eyes holding a mixture of terror and the fierce, burning loyalty of their ancestors. They were the future, now called upon to die for the past. They were stationed on the hills overlooking the castle, the perfect, tragic vantage point from which to watch their world turn to ash. Inside the castle walls, the women of Ieyasu did not retreat into the shadows. They formed their own defense corps, trained and led by women like Yamamoto Yi, loading modern rifles and preparing to stand alongside their men. These were not symbols of grace and delicacy. They were the last, fierce defenders of a dying age. They stood ready to unleash a terror that defied the samurai's own code of honor, the terror of a cornered, loyal people who had nothing left to lose. They waited. The atmosphere grew thick and heavy, a suffocating silence punctuated only by the frantic movement of preparation. Then, the enemy arrived. The imperial forces, 1,000 strong, were a dark, disciplined tide, their ranks flowing over the flat plains surrounding Wakamatsu. Their presence was a visual mockery of the samurai banners, clean, modern uniforms, sleek rifles, and the constant, unnerving gleam of foreign brass. They did not pause. They did not parley. The long, bloody journey from Kyoto had finally brought them to the heart of the resistance. From the high command came the order. The sound was not the clean, sharp crack of a rifle, but a low, world-shaking roar. The first imperial artillery shell arced high above the rice fields, carrying the devastating promise of modernization and change. It slammed into the outer defenses of Wakamatsu, sending earth and stone into the air. The sound was the final bell tolling for the Ieyasu domain. It was the sound of the future demanding its entry. The siege had begun. And in the midst of that chaos, in the smoke and the desperate rallying cries, the Tokugawa dream, the 260 years of steel, silence, and isolation, was finally making its desperate final stand. The gates were closed, but the enemy was already inside the walls of history. The battle for Ieyasu had only just begun. 260 years is a long sleep for any nation. The Tokugawa Shogunate achieved what few dynasties ever could: absolute, unchallenged silence. They took a broken landscape of feuding warlords and forged it whole, not just with iron and blood, but with an unyielding policy of isolation. The result was Sakoku, the locked country, a great peace paid for by a greater silence. For generations, the outside world became a ghost, a fading rumor carried only on the rare, forbidden wind. The knowledge of the West of global progress was carefully curated and then aggressively forgotten. The Tokugawa mind understood a crucial truth, that new ideas are the single greatest enemy of total control. This was the strange, almost dreamlike stillness of the Edo period, a society perfectly ordered, existing in an artificial, self-imposed vacuum. The price of this immense stability was the stifling of curiosity. The cost of their unique culture was the loss of global context. Japan became a meticulously crafted box, refining its own light, its own aesthetic, while the industrializing world beyond its steel-plated harbors raced far ahead. The years passed in a ritualistic, unchanging cycle. The world moved on, but Japan remained anchored, a powerful antique preserved in amber. But a steel door, no matter how thick, cannot hold back the tide forever. The silence was not emptiness. It was a debt, accumulating interest year after year until the moment of reckoning. When Commodore Perry's black ships finally breached the isolation, they did not just bring steam and cannon. They brought the future. The suddenness of the collision was a shockwave that shattered 2 centuries of meticulous order. The shogunate fell, but the spirit of that long silence endures. It gave Japan a unique, resilient soul, a culture so deeply rooted it survived the chaos of the modern age and remade itself anew. We look back and see the powerful irony. To save the nation, they locked it away. And when the lock finally broke, the world rushed in, changing the land forever, but never quite erasing the memory of that steel and silence.